Good day, Helena, and thank you very much for joining us from Australia this morning to talk to the Mint.
Very happy to be here.
Brilliant. Well, what I'd like to start with is to talk about what an economy of care is, because I know this is an area that you've had a lot of interest in. What does an economy of care mean to you?
An economy of care means an economic system where we prioritize all the caring work and professions. And I often talk about the importance of looking at how we grow our food and how we grow our children. And in those arenas, the dominant economy has managed to turn them into sort of shadow work, unimportant work, in many, sort of shadow invisible work. So the caring economy needs to bring those back into the center, to prioritize those activities, and to provide many more livelihoods in those arenas, rather than supporting a path which is continually replacing people with energy and technology. Even when that technology is in the form of chemicals, whether agricultural chemicals or pharmaceutical chemicals, it replaces people. And we need to look at how we shift our subsidies and those mechanisms that push economic progress forward.
It's interesting, actually, that here in the UK, I was noticing in the recent Labour Party conference that they're talking, the Shadow Chancellor was talking about the everyday economy and sort of refocusing our thinking that actually most people are involved in the nuts and bolts, the everyday economy, which is a sort of housing, food, care, public services, etc. Do you see other areas beginning to take more seriously this sort of core economy that links us up and is the basis of our...
Well, I mean, first of all, I beg to differ with that, Minister, because in actual fact, most of us are not involved in those very important activities of how we feed, clothe, and house ourselves. We've ended up as appendages to vast systems, often in work that's very unproductive, and certainly to the extent that it's linked to food production or the care of children or healthcare or education. It's become so bureaucratized and so disembodied that most teachers and doctors now spend more time on the computer filling out paper than they do actually attending to their students or patients. So I think we really need a big picture analysis to understand what's going on. And I think it is that there's been this systematic replacement of people to do this very important work, because we've basically ended up subsidizing a financial casino and giant global corporations to create dependence. We are all becoming more and more dependent on those in very tiny and very specialized roles that feed and fuel this vast system.
So just, yes, picking up that sort of issue of the education system and the health system, you're saying that the sort of actual basic sort of relationship to people within the education and health system has been sort of undermined by wider bureaucratic systems.
Absolutely.
And why do you think that's happened?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because I think it's very important that we look behind the government structures and understand that it really has to do with an economic trajectory that does go back several generations, and that has to do with the fact that our system, from its very outset, was about supporting global trade and global traders. And even in banking, we have seen, if we analyze it clearly, a systematic shift towards supporting the global at the expense of local, regional, and national businesses and banks. In the process, this has been systematically linked to what seemed to be cheap fossil fuels, which were never cheap, but they appeared in the market as though they were cheap because we were essentially hiding their cost. We didn't have proper accounting. And so with a lot of that cheap oil, people were driven away from the land, so away from farming, into the city, replaced by more and more machinery, And right now, the UN is promoting a shift towards an even bigger takeover of jobs by drones. First of all, robots on the land linked to drones, linked to satellites to monitor carbon. So we have a very big job now to step back and just look honestly at this. It's not about blaming particular governments or particular corporations or anyone for that matter. It's really about understanding that we're heading in a very, very wrong direction. And again, maybe the two key things we need to look at is how we are often now without even recognizing it. And I'm talking about even the ministers in the government not recognizing the end result, the big picture of what they're doing, and certainly not the voter. So we're talking about, as I say, systematically subsidizing energy-intensive, resource-intensive, technology-based development to support more and more global players. And that's why we also see this accumulation of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer corporations and individuals that are operating globally. In the meanwhile, at the local and national level, businesses and individuals are heavily taxed and heavily regulated. So another mechanism that we need to look at is that at the global level, we've had a process of systematic deregulation, meaning that global businesses are getting the freedom to move in and out of national economies without any constraints. On the contrary, they are now constraining governments by forcing governments to sign ISDS clauses in which the governments say, yes, yes, we agree. We will not do anything that might reduce your profit-making potential. If we do, you have the right to take us to court, rather quiet kangaroo courts. So I think it's something that big business is not very keen to hear, but it's really so important that they wake up to what they're doing because they're threatening their own jobs. You know, even if you're the CEO of Mobil, you were threatened by linking with Exxon. So then you have only one CEO instead of two CEOs. So it's this crazy, crazy rat race.
Now, you've obviously covered a huge amount of ground there, which has slightly moved us away from the health system, but we'll move with it. And I mean, there are maybe two different issues here. Obviously, that you talk about the problem of the global and in a way, the solution at the local level by sort of freeing up and supporting the local level. Can we focus on the latter, actually? Because in a way, maybe if people had more of a vision of what the local would look like and how it could work for them, they'd be more willing to sort of desert the global, if you like. So have you got examples, of areas that have gone more local? I mean, I know food is the one that you always jump on, but that's to some extent the easiest one, isn't it? Because your food can grow locally, but there's obviously lots of other parts of the economy. What other emerging examples of localization happening and to give an idea what that might look like?
Yeah, but I do want to stress that food is the single most important sector in the sense that there's nothing else that human beings produce that every human being needs every single day. So to have policies where our governments are separating us further and further from the source of that food through these policies that support global trade, which leads to import and export of identical food, means food is being flown across the world to be processed and flown back again. The global food system is the biggest main contributor to climate change, to biodiversity loss, to toxic pesticides, etc., to the mountains of plastic. So focusing on a shift in food is so fundamental. And there we have splendid examples around the world of where people have intuitively just reacted to the craziness and started rebuilding more localized systems. They've realized that if they want fresh, healthy food, they need to shorten the distances. When you shorten the distance between the farm and the market pressures for diversification. The local farmers market or shop doesn't want tons of straight carrots. In fact, in that market, people are perfectly happy if some carrots are big and some are crooked, and even if they have some blemishes, because it's a sign that they have not been first of all, produced to look good, produced for transport, and it's not a supermarket system where sometimes half of them have been thrown away or burned because they didn't fit the machinery. So this is a tremendously important issue.
But can I just take the issue of, I mean, we obviously have farm markets extensively and farm market shops in the UK, but they tend to be, I would say, a middle class activity, expensive, and, you know, whereas the big problems of food insecurity that we have, of course, and bad diet, etc., is happening amongst people who would not be able to afford to go to the farmers market.
Yeah, and this is where it's so vitally important that we look at the economic policies that, as I say, even within the government, things are so systemic now, and this absolute faith in global trade, global trade, global trade. And England was subjected to propaganda for these years over Brexit. Where are we going to get the better trade deal? The better trade deal. So people have been brainwashed into believing that global trade is the way to grow the economy, is the way to make sure that I have a job, that I'm able to pay the mortgage. But what we have to understand is that the consequence of this is that local becomes more expensive than global product. And that's why around the world, I've seen it in Kenya, I've seen it in Mongolia, I've seen it literally all around the world, food from thousands of miles away generally costs less than local food.
But isn't that...
Why is that? That's where we have to look at fresh economic thinking.
But isn't a sort of key factor there economies of scale? That, you know,
no,
if you're...
absolutely not.
Why not?
This is, I would say, the most important, perhaps, point in fresh economic thinking. We have to fundamentally understand the ecological realities of the real economy. The real economy is the living earth. The living earth is diversity. And it's not only diversity in terms of different plants and different animals. We're talking about realities that are constantly changing. Now, what we have created are systems that impose monoculture. And that's why we have turned, lush land into deserts and so on. So when it comes to all the primary production of fishery, forestry, farming, we need to completely turn thinking around to understand that because local markets demand diversity, they are fundamentally ecological markets. They will help restore ecosystems. Small, diversified farms are actually even today producing something like 80% of the food. That's because in the global south, it's still mainly peasant agriculture.
But there, I mean, this is an important point because there is a huge difference, isn't there, between somewhere like the UK, where the vast majority of food is through a centralized national, international system, through supermarkets, huge quantity, and so on, and the rest of the world. So, and you were telling me earlier that one of the things that have given you a different perspective on the world is going out to the grassroots around the world. So would you say that actually the rest of the world who have not been taken over by these international food systems have a better chance of survival under climate change, more resilience, and are actually going to be the future?
In some respects, yes, but what's very frightening is that in those rural communities of the so-called third world or south, so much has also been destroyed and is continuing to be destroyed through huge corporate land grabs, through mining, and many of these farming communities were already marginalized through slavery and later on colonialism. But still, I would say if there were an emperor of the world who said, as of tomorrow, we're all going to survive off our own skills and our own resources, absolutely, in the third world, people would be a lot better off than we would be in the Western world. And so they still have more skills, a bit more diversification, the food a little bit closer, and also a little bit more of the intergenerational community fabric, where there is this support within what I say a genuinely caring economy, where the elders are not shoved off into an institution, but are actually very often involved in childcare, and so that most mothers have many carers for every child, and it's often non-commercialized. The cause of all of that is a wealth that is fundamental to human health and well-being, and yet is not paid. It doesn't register in our account sheets. So very often the poorest of the poor, like in Bhutan or Ladakh, where I have worked, are actually among the wealthiest people in the world in real terms.
So how, yes, we've now moved, interestingly, back into the health space, which is great. Do you think there is a connection there? I mean, if we move to more local food economies here, if we could build those local food economies, do you think that can have a spin-off effect in terms of relationships and
it does, you see, it does. It's so wonderful to study it. In England too, if people hear this and maybe start looking, they'll see it. They'll see the difference between shopping in the farmer's market and shopping in the supermarket. They'll see that in the farmer's market, people often go and spend time because they enjoy it. There's actually space for children. There is an atmosphere of real human connectedness and interdependence. In those markets, we are magically paying farmers much more than they get in the supermarket system. I mean, in many cases, they're getting virtually 100% of what we pay, whereas in the supermarkets, they're getting roughly 10%. The consumer is also paying less for genuinely healthy, fresh food that is produced in a way that is supportive of, reducing climate emissions, reducing plastic, and restoring wildlife. So if I could just say one more thing about diversity, if you took any two plots of land, a square meter, a square kilometer, if you diversified on one and use monoculture on the other, you would always be able to produce much more through diversification. I don't think most people have to be too ecologically literate to understand that. And it's particularly true when you have more mixed farming, where you even have some animals, like in some of the fields in Asia, ducks that eat weeds in the rice paddies. And then you have the fertilizer, they're weeding, and you get protein. So, but I also just want to add that you were saying, what about beyond food? And beyond food, there is a localization movement that, particularly as we promoted in Local Futures, is building on that fundamentally ecological economy of diversification and a focus on food and farming, but is also building to support human scale, localized businesses, more human scale financing. And we can show how the money circulates when you have investment from the community for the community. You get a completely different picture from what you get when you have an outside investor who always will want to extract more wealth than they put in. So in terms of a circular carrying economy, we need to look at localizing.
So what sort of, are you talking about, like sort of local currencies or community investment?
No, I'm not talking about local currencies. We have been, we've been promoting localization for more than 40 years, and we actually started local currencies, and they ran for maybe 10 years. It was in America. Our main office is in America. And we've seen, even my friend George Ferguson, who was the mayor of Bristol, helped to launch a local currency there. And I thought, well, maybe now, it's going to really work when you have the support of the local government. But in a system where our governments are so heavily subsidizing the global, where we have through that a financial casino that is able to create money out of thin air, that's what's happening. And after 2008, the whole world knew that this casino is dangerous. It's playing with our lives. We need to regulate it. There needs to be some oversight. That, however, didn't happen. So we're in a very dangerous situation because we're creating this supposed wealth at the top that is not able to sustain life. It can only operate to support vast monocultures, top-down structures. So we've been starting a local currency. Is not now the most strategic way. The most strategic way for communities to get active is to set up local funds, some of which are happening with individuals just donating £100 or so, some of which are happening like right here, where 20 people put $50,000 each and create $1 million to support local business. That kind of subsidy from local community members. And before you were saying about local food being mainly middle class, right now we should be demanding that the middle classes really start taking action, because to ask the youth, to ask marginalized people, to ask the most desperate and stressed members of our community to lead the way is ridiculous. But the middle classes who have a little bit of time, few resources, are actually creatively helping to subsidize a healthy, caring economy. And that creating models that then hopefully will be, the information about them will be dispersed more widely so that we can see real policy change.
What sort of specifics of the models in terms of the mechanisms to make them work?
Well, I mean, one of them is to prevent the political correctness that in America is undermining a lot of very good initiatives. For instance, there was a business alliance for local living economies started by a friend of mine, which is making huge strides, but it's been undermined by the idea that it should only be led by and focus on the most marginal and impoverished people. Now, there are certain agendas there. There are certain corporate think tanks that are helping to put these ideas out. And it's very unfortunate. I really feel we should be demanding of the middle classes that they take action. We have a huge responsibility because we are in a position, as I said, have just that little bit of financial security and time. And we are hurtling in a really disastrous direction if we don't wake up to the economic systemic underpinnings that have created the climate crisis, that have created a complete breakdown of democracy, epidemics of depression, etc. We really need to wake up and deal with this economic transition.
But sometimes I suppose the middle classes can be seen to be sort of lecturing, can't they? And telling the poor you don't know how to eat, and you're no wonder you're obese or unhealthy or whatever.
This is what the corporate global media want us to think. What's actually happening on the ground is that middle class people are setting up local food systems where those who can afford it subsidize people in the community who cannot afford to pay as much, so they can afford to have healthy, organic, genuinely nutrient-rich food. And throughout Japan, after COVID especially, mothers realized we need to protect our seeds, which were threatened by trade treaties, that the Japanese were not going to be able to protect their own rice varieties. So they've created a whole movement of seed saving, pressuring local governments, and there is some policy change reaching to the level of local government. That's very interesting. For instance, in America now, in numerous states, people who have food stamps from the government will get twice as much value if they buy from the local farmers market instead of the supermarket. So they are simultaneously supporting the poor and healthy agriculture. So there are these very significant small-scale initiatives growing, but they need help because we as you know, we're facing very serious crises.
We are. And just to move into a slightly different sphere, at the moment, I understand at the international level, there is a big conflict in terms of perspectives happening in terms of UN meetings and a counter people's meeting on the food front. What's happening there?
Well, what's happening there is that tragically, the UN, which is of course just appointees from national governments, so national governments around the world have just fallen prey to this belief that if we don't go along with this change, if we don't support, and they still naively believe that they're supporting their supposedly national multinationals. So Sweden still believes that we need to support Volvo, and that means that trade treaties need to be negotiated in secrecy. very naive. Mitsubishi said to Japan a long time ago, sorry, we're not really Japanese anymore, because, when you're producing in Brazil and selling in China, what makes you Japanese? So this wake up is so urgently needed, again, without any blame and with the recognition that both left and right governments, of this sort of political flavor within the industrialized world have been pursuing the same policies. So it's really now at the level of the UN. That means that this conglomeration of national governments are also going along with corporate pressure. And in the food world, as I said earlier, the FAO is promoting replacing farmers with robots, arguing that they're going to be spraying more efficiently, arguing that young people don't really want to farm. They like to be on the screen. We'll give them a screen, and then they can just tap on the screen and the robots will do the work. They'll be linked to drones, linked to satellites to monitor carbon. Carbon as the currency of climate is a corporate invention. Again, not probably through bad intentions, but when global corporations have the right to determine how to frame the climate issue, they're not going to see their own shadow. They're not going to see it doesn't make sense to fly fish from Norway, England, America, Australia to China to be deboned and flown back again to those respective countries. That shouldn't be allowed.
So this international technical solutions approach is taken over. And what about the counter group? I mean, the fight back, which you, I think, are involved in. What are you doing?
Yeah, so the counter movement consists of sort of collaboration between several different groups. One of the most important is La Via Campesina, which started in '92 in opposition to the trade treaties. These were small farmers from all around the world, particularly starting in South America, who were saying, please, 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 this sort of free trade thing means you're dumping food on us and destroying our market. Please don't destroy our farming. Don't destroy our right to feed our own people, our own country first. But their voices haven't got up. Now a little bit more, but of course in this summit, even though there were groups there representing hundreds of millions of farmers, there's been very little in the media. I think I saw one article in The Guardian. So the big, big task today is for me, the big activism is to help share this bigger picture information. And it's a very positive picture once you understand that there is so much positive on the at the level of the grassroots, demonstrating the multiple more localized human scale structures, understanding that we're all unique individuals. Every single tree, every single thing that lives is unique and changing. How can we run an economy where we respect that diversity, respect that even genuine individualism, and where we're able to be more responsive and actually far more efficient in terms of what life demands? So the vast monocultural systems and imposition is leading to a lot of anger at the grassroots, particularly now in COVID, with many people only looking to the level of government and with great anger, assuming that everyone in power is completely conscious of how they're destroying our life and they have hidden agendas. The sort of conspiracy theories, the anger is multiplying very rapidly. So it's so important to try to get a more honest analysis out of what's going on and how and why we find ourselves in such a mess.
Well, I totally support and salute you there, and I wish you the best with trying to raise awareness of this counterculture, because it is true, isn't it, that the technical narrative has become so dominant. And thank you very much for talking to me, and I look forward to talking further in the future.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity.